The room went completely still the moment I walked through those doors. My aunt covered her mouth with her hand, but the laugh still escaped. Short, sharp, dismissive. My uncle looked at me the way he always had, like I was something that didn't quite fit where I was standing. He shook his head once, slowly, the way you do when a child embarrasses you in public. But the judge, Judge Warren, a heavy-set man with silver hair and reading glasses pushed halfway down his nose, he stopped mid-sentence. His pen hovered above the paper. He looked at me the way people look at something they can't immediately place but know they should recognize. The whole courtroom heard him murmur it, barely above a whisper. Well, I'll be damned. That was the first time in 32 years that my aunt and uncle had nothing to say. 3 days before that morning, I had been elbow-deep in the engine of my neighbor's truck when my phone buzzed against the driveway concrete. I almost didn't answer it. The number was a Kentucky area code I hadn't seen in 6 years, and nothing good had ever come from Harlan County that wasn't wrapped in the smell of my grandmother's biscuits. It was a paralegal named Diane from the offices of Whitfield & Sons, estate law. Her voice was professionally kind, the kind that means the news isn't good. Miss Mitchell, I'm calling regarding the estate of Ruth Ann Mitchell. As the named heir in her will, you're required to appear in Harlan County probate court on Thursday. There's been a formal contest filed. I set down my socket wrench. Filed by who? A pause. By Gary and Linda Phelps, your aunt and uncle. I stood up slowly, wiping my hands on a shop rag I didn't remember grabbing. My dog Biscuit, a 3-legged beagle I'd pulled out of a drainage ditch 2 winters ago, looked up at me from the shade of the porch like he already knew. Of course they did, I said quietly. I thanked Diane, hung up, and stood in my driveway for a long time watching a hawk circle over the tree line at the edge of the property. Grandma Ruth had passed 6 weeks earlier. Congestive heart failure, the hospital said, quick at the end. I'd driven through the night to be there, held her hand while she slept, and made it just in time to hear her say my name one more time before she didn't say anything at all. My aunt and uncle had arrived 3 hours later after she was already gone and spent the next 2 days making a list of everything in the house. I hadn't spoken to either of them since the funeral. Grandma Ruth's house sat on 4 acres outside of Harlan, a white clapboard 2-story with a covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides and a kitchen that always smelled like coffee and wood smoke. Her late husband, my grandfather Earl, had built most of it himself after coming home from Korea in 1953. He died before I was born. But Grandma kept his photograph on the mantel and his reading chair by the window, like he'd just stepped out for a moment and would be right back. She'd raised me in that house from the time I was 9, after my mother, her daughter, decided that being a parent was something she'd reconsider later. She never did reconsider, but Grandma Ruth never once made me feel like a burden. She made me feel like the whole point of everything. When I graduated from high school, she drove me to the Army recruiting office herself. You've always been the kind of girl who runs toward things, she told me in the parking lot, straightening my collar the same way she had on the first day of school. Just make sure what you're running toward is worth it. I spent 9 years in the Army as a combat medic, eventually making captain. I deployed twice, once to Afghanistan, once to Iraq. I came home the second time with a Bronze Star, a shoulder that ached in cold weather, and a clarity about what mattered that I hadn't had before I left. Grandma Ruth was on that list. She always had been. My aunt and uncle were not. Linda and Gary Phelps had spent 20 years treating Grandma Ruth like a retirement account they were waiting to cash out. They visited at Thanksgiving when it was convenient, called on her birthday if they remembered, and sent fruit baskets at Christmas that she always donated to the church food pantry because she said they tasted like obligation. When her health started declining, it was me who drove 6 hours from Fort Campbell to sit with her at doctor's appointments. It was me who arranged the home health aide, set up the automatic prescription refills, and made sure the furnace was serviced before winter. My aunt called twice during that whole stretch, once to ask if Grandma had updated her will, once to ask again. Now they were contesting it. I sat on my porch that evening with biscuit across my feet and the court notice on the table beside me. The sun went down slow and orange over the ridge, the same way it always did in September, and I thought about not going, about letting the lawyers handle it, about being too tired to fight one more thing. Then I went inside and opened the cedar chest at the foot of my bed. My dress uniform was folded the way I'd left it after my last formal inspection. Dark green, pressed sharp, every ribbon and badge in its proper place. The bronze star sat second from the left on the top row. Below it, the Army Commendation Medal, the Combat Medic Badge, 11 years of service laid out in 4 inches of fabric. I lifted the jacket and held it up in the lamplight. Biscuit clicked across the floor and sat at my feet, watching me with his one serious eye. "I know," I said. "It's a lot. But the thing about a uniform is that it doesn't let you pretend. You can't wear it halfway. You either are what it says you are, or you're not." And I had earned every piece of what was on that jacket in places my aunt and uncle had never had to think about. I hung it on the back of the door and went to bed. I made the drive to Harlan early Thursday morning, leaving before the sun was fully up, with a thermos of coffee and biscuit riding shotgun with his nose against the window crack. The mountains came up green and heavy around the highway, fog still clinging to the lower ridges, and for a while it was quiet enough that I could almost pretend I was just going home to visit. But I wasn't visiting. I was defending it. The courthouse in Harlan was an old stone building on the main square. American flag out front, steps worn soft in the middle from decades of feet. I found parking on the side street and sat in the truck for a minute, finishing my coffee, watching a mockingbird argue with a squirrel in the oak tree across the lot. I'd faced a lot of things in my life that were harder than this. I reminded myself of that fact plainly, the way you do when sentiment starts threatening to cloud your thinking. Then I got out of the truck, straightened my jacket, and walked up those worn stone steps. The courtroom was smaller than I remembered from the one time I'd been inside it as a teenager. Some minor thing about a vehicle registration I'd rather not revisit. Dark wood paneling, 6 rows of benches, a ceiling fan that moved the warm air around without actually cooling anything. A few other families waited on the benches, their own small dramas folded in their laps. My aunt and uncle were already seated at the petitioner's table. Linda had her hair done and wore a blazer the color of a funeral. Gary sat beside her in his good shirt, the one he saved for occasions when he needed people to think well of him. They had an attorney with them, a local man I didn't recognize. Youngish, with a leather portfolio he kept opening and closing. They looked up when I walked in. Linda's laugh was involuntary, the kind that gets away from you before your manners can stop it. She pressed her fingers to her mouth, but her eyes stayed amused, scanning me from the brass buttons to the polished shoes like I was wearing a Halloween costume. Gary just shook his head, slow and deliberate, the same expression he'd used at Grandma's kitchen table when I was 16 and told him I wanted to enlist instead of go to community college. Like I'd said something embarrassing. I walked past them without stopping and took my seat at the respondent's table. I had no attorney. I didn't need one. I had a folder of documents that I'd spent 2 evenings compiling. Receipts, bank transfers, medical appointment records, a copy of the power of attorney Grandma Ruth had signed over to me 4 years ago, and a certified copy of the will. Judge Warren entered, and the room settled. He was older than I expected from his voice on the recorded court notice. Late 60s, deliberate in his movements, with the patient expression of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by what families were capable of doing to each other. He set his papers on the bench and looked out over the room. His eyes reached me and stopped. He didn't say anything immediately. He put on his reading glasses, looked down at his docket, then looked back up at me. Something shifted in his face. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition working its way to the surface. He cleared his throat and called the case. Gary and Linda's attorney stood and delivered his opening in the confident, practiced tone of someone who'd done this many times in small county courtrooms and knew how to make a simple thing sound inevitable. His clients, he said, had been the primary caregivers for Ruth Ann Mitchell in the final years of her life. They had contributed financially and personally to her well-being. The named heir had been largely absent due to military service, and while that service was commendable, absence was absence. The will, he suggested, did not reflect the true wishes of a woman who had come to rely on Gary and Linda Phelps. I listened without moving. I'd heard better arguments from people who were actually right about something. When he finished, Judge Warren looked at me. "Miss Mitchell, you're representing yourself?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Captain Mitchell," he said, almost to himself, and then stopped. He leaned forward slightly. "Forgive me. Are you the same Sarah Mitchell who served with the 68 Medical Brigade out of Fort Campbell?" The attorney blinked. Gary said, "What?" under his breath. I kept my voice even. "Yes, sir." The judge sat back. He took his glasses off and turned them in his hands for a moment. "I have a nephew who came home from Kandahar in 2019. He's mentioned your unit. Said a medic named Mitchell kept his squad moving when they had no business still being on their feet." He paused. "I may be misremembering. I don't know your nephew's name, Your Honor, but I remember Kandahar." The courtroom had gone very quiet. Linda was no longer smiling. Judge Warren put his glasses back on. "All right, let's look at the evidence. Miss Captain Mitchell, you have documents?" I opened my folder and laid everything flat on the table in the order I'd organized it. 4 years of pharmacy pickup confirmations with my signature. Bank transfers to the Home Health Agency. 12 of them, monthly, from my military account and later from my VA disability pay. Utility bills in my name going back to 2019, because Grandma Ruth had asked me to take over the accounts after she got confused by an online billing change and accidentally canceled her electric service for a week in February. I had the letter she'd written me when I made captain, kept in a plastic sleeve because the ink had faded on the fold lines from how many times I'd opened and reread it in places far from home. I didn't enter it as evidence, I just knew it was there. "Your Honor," I said, "my aunt and uncle are claiming caregiver status. I have here a log of every doctor's appointment my grandmother attended in the last 4 years. I drove to 41 of them, according to the facility's own intake records, which I requested through a HIPAA authorization she signed before she passed. My aunt was present at 3, my uncle at 1. The attorney shifted in his seat. "Your Honor, my clients were not always able to. Gary and Linda Phelps also claimed financial contribution to the property," I continued. "The property tax records from Harlan County show continuous payment from a checking account registered in my name since 2018. I have the bank statements." I slid the documents across to the clerk without drama. Gary's face had gone from confident to careful. Linda was whispering something to the attorney. The judge reviewed the pages in silence. The ceiling fan turned. Someone outside in the hall dropped something metal and it echoed through the old walls. "Mr. Phelps," Judge Warren said finally, without looking up. "Your wife was present at 3 medical appointments for her mother over a 4-year period." Gary opened his mouth. "I'm noting that for the record," the judge said. "I'm not asking a question." He read a little longer. Then he set the papers down and looked at my aunt and uncle with the expression of a man who had specifically stopped being surprised but wasn't above being disappointed. "There is no legal basis for this contest," he said. "Ruth Ann Mitchell's will is clear. The named heir has demonstrated consistent, documented financial and personal support of the deceased. The petition is denied." His gavel came down once, clean and final, like a door being shut on a very long argument. Gary stood up halfway, his chair scraping back. "She was never even here. She was off playing soldier well, sir." The bailiff took 1 step forward. Gary sat back down. I gathered my documents carefully, squared the edges of the folder, and stood. My shoulder ached the way it always did when I'd been sitting still too long. I picked up my hat and walked toward the door. Behind me, I heard my aunt say his name, just Gary, soft and flat, and that was the end of it. Outside, the September air hit me full in the face, warm and carrying the smell of the mountains and somebody's wood fire starting up early. I stood on the courthouse steps for a moment and breathed it in. A man in a veteran's cap coming up the steps nodded at my uniform and said, Thank you, in the shorthand way that means more than the words. I nodded back. In the truck, Biscuit climbed half into my lap, which he was not supposed to do and which I allowed anyway. I sat there with one hand on his back and the other on the steering wheel, not driving anywhere yet, just being still. I thought about calling someone. There wasn't really anyone to call. My mother was somewhere in Arizona, last I heard. I had friends from the service scattered across 4 states, but it was a Thursday morning and they had their own lives moving. I thought about Grandma Ruth and what she would have said if she could have been there. Probably something like, "I told you to bring a cardigan. It gets cold in those old buildings." I smiled at the windshield. I drove out to the house. The property looked exactly the way it had every other time I'd come back. Pine trees thick along the left side of the driveway, the white fence needing paint, the porch swing moving slightly in the breeze even though there was no one on it. Grandma Ruth used to say that porch swing moved on its own because Grandpa Earl was always coming back to check on things. I unlocked the front door and stood in the entry for a minute, letting the smell of the house settle over me. Old wood and coffee and something faintly floral from the dried lavender she kept in a basket by the stairs. Everything was exactly as she'd left it. I hadn't changed anything, hadn't moved anything. The reading chair was still by the window. His photograph was still on the mantel. I walked through each room slowly, not looking for anything in particular, just being present in a place that had held me when I needed holding. In her bedroom, on the nightstand, there was a small cedar box I'd seen my whole life but never opened. She kept it there the way some people keep a Bible, present, important, not for everyday handling. I picked it up carefully. Inside was a folded note in her handwriting, and beneath it, Grandpa Earl's dog tags, the metal worn smooth and warm from years of being held. The note said, "For Sarah. He always wanted a soldier in the family. Turns out we got the best one. All my love. Always. Grandma Ruth." I sat on the edge of her bed and held the dog tags in my palm for a long time. Biscuit came and lay down across my feet. The light through the bedroom curtains was the particular gold of a Kentucky September afternoon, the kind that slants in low and makes everything look a little sacred. I didn't cry right then. I did later, outside on the porch steps as the sun dropped behind the ridge, and it wasn't the sad kind. It was the kind that comes when something that's been wound tight for a very long time finally lets go. My phone buzzed twice that evening, both from numbers I didn't recognize, both with Kentucky area codes. I didn't answer. Whatever my aunt and uncle wanted to say, I had already said what I needed to say in that courtroom, and I had said it calmly, in writing, with documentation, which was more than they deserved. There was a third call, an hour later, from a number I recognized. It was my Aunt Linda. I almost let it go to voicemail. Then I picked up. She didn't say hello. She said, "I didn't know you were paying her bills." I looked out at the dark tree line. "I know you didn't. Gary thought." She stopped. "It doesn't matter what Gary thought." "No," I agreed. "It doesn't." There was a long silence. I could hear her breathing, controlled and careful, the way she always was when she was trying to hold herself together in front of someone she'd rather not let see her fracture. "She talked about you," Linda said finally. "All the time. Even when we were there, she'd find a way to bring you up. What you'd said on the phone, where you were deployed. She had that map on the kitchen wall with the little pins. I hadn't known about the map. I had to press my lips together for a second. She was proud of you," Linda said. The words came out sounding like something she'd had to decide to say. I think I was jealous of that, which is a terrible thing to admit about your own mother. I didn't answer immediately. I watched a firefly blink twice at the edge of the yard. "She was proud of you too," I said. "She told me every time you visited, she said you always brought her those little soaps she liked." Silence again. Then a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something else. "Those soaps were from the hotel gift shop," Linda said. I never remembered what kind she actually used. "Lavender," I said. "She used lavender." "I'll remember that," she said quietly. for whatever it's worth now. We said goodbye without warmth but without sharpness either. It was the most honest conversation we had ever had. I figured that was worth something, even if neither of us was quite ready to call it a beginning. The next 2 weekends I drove back to the house and started working. The fence needed paint, the gutters needed clearing, 2 boards on the porch steps had gone soft with rot. I didn't call anyone for help. I didn't need to. I knew how to work, and I knew how to be patient with things that were broken, because the Army had taught me that most broken things are fixable if you take your time and use the right tools. Biscuit supervised from the porch while I worked, which mainly involved him sleeping and occasionally raising his head to confirm I was still there. On the 3rd weekend, a truck pulled into the driveway in the late afternoon. I was up on a ladder rehanging one of the shutters and didn't hear it until the engine cut off. I climbed down and turned around. It was Gary. He stood by the truck with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the repaired fence and the freshly painted porch rails and the new boards on the steps. He looked older than he had in the courtroom, more tired. Like the argument had been the thing holding him upright, and now that it was over, he wasn't sure what to do with his posture. "Linda told me you were out here," he said. "I know," I said. "I told her she could." He nodded. He looked at the shutter in my hand, then at the house, then at some point in the middle distance that had nothing particular in it. "Earl built this place himself," he said. "Did you know that?" Ruth used to say he'd never built anything before in his life. Bought the land and just started. "She told me," I said. "She said he built the kitchen first so she'd have a warm place to work while he was still finishing the rest." Gary almost smiled. "That sounds like him." From what she said, he shifted his weight. The evening had gone quiet the way it does in the mountains when the birds stop and the wind drops, and everything holds still for a moment. "I shouldn't have said what I said in the courtroom," he said finally. "About you playing soldier." I looked at him. "You weren't playing," he said. "I know that. I knew it when I said it." He picked a flake of old paint off the fence rail and dropped it. Gary Phelps has a way of saying the meanest version of what he means when he's scared. Ruth used to tell me that. Said it every year for 40 years and I never did anything about it. "She was right," I said. "Yeah." He put his hands back in his pockets. "She usually was." We stood there without talking for a minute. The first fireflies were starting, just a few early ones, testing the dark at the edge of the tree line. "You know she kept a scrapbook," he said. "About your deployments. News clippings mostly, anything she could find. She had the whole thing on the coffee table the last time we visited. Showed it to us like it was a photo album." He paused. I didn't look at it the way I should have. I didn't say anything to that. I didn't have to. He took one hand out of his pocket and held something out toward me, a small photograph. Edges bent, the color faded to the warm tones of something taken in the 80s. Grandma Ruth and a young woman I recognized as a younger version of my mother, standing in front of this house with the porch still unfinished behind them. They were squinting into the sun and laughing at something outside the frame. "Found it in a box when we were clearing her room," he said. "After the funeral. Thought you might want it." I took it carefully. "Thank you," I said. He nodded once. Got back in his truck. Drove away without any grand speeches or apologies beyond the one he'd already made, which was the only kind that counted anyway. I stood in the driveway holding the photograph until his taillights disappeared around the bend. Then I walked back to the porch and sat down on the new boards I'd laid that morning, Biscuit pressing warm against my side, the photograph in one hand and Grandpa Earl's dog tags in the other. The mountains were going dark at the edges, the sky still that deep clear blue it gets in the last 10 minutes before it shifts to black. Somewhere down the road, a neighbor was burning something, leaves, maybe, and the smoke drifted faintly sweet across the yard. I thought about a lot of things in that half-dark. About Grandma Ruth's map with the little pins. About 32-year-old Captain Sarah Mitchell sitting on the steps of a Kentucky probate courthouse with her discharge papers and her bronze star and a 3-legged beagle, doing the math on what any of it had cost and what it had been worth. about the fact that the people who love you correctly are rarely the ones you expected, and sometimes the ones you did expect come around late, imperfectly, in the driveway at dusk with a bent old photograph, which is better than not at all. About my grandmother telling me in a parking lot 23 years ago to run toward things worth running toward. I still was. The next morning I drove into town and stopped at the small hardware store on Main Street for more paint. The man behind the counter was maybe 70 with a Marine's cap on the hook by his register and the look of someone who doesn't make small talk but means every word he does say. He saw my jacket. I'd kept the uniform on for the drive back, have it more than anything, and said, "Combat medic?" "Yes, sir." He nodded with the slow approval of someone who knows what that badge actually means. My granddaughter just started her EMT certification. Says she wants to go military after. "Tell her it's worth it," I said. He bagged my paint and said, "I will." And that was the whole conversation, and it was enough. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday in October when the leaves had gone full color and the air smelled like apples and cold coming, I drove out to the farmhouse and sat on the porch with my coffee and watched the mountains do what they had been doing my whole life, standing still and magnificent and completely indifferent to whatever the people below them were arguing about. I had repainted the fence, replaced the gutters, fixed the swing so it moved without the grinding sound it had made for years. The flag I'd found in the cedar chest, an old folded one, the kind presented at military funerals. I'd mounted on the post by the front door the way Grandpa Earl used to keep it, though his had been from an earlier war. Biscuit had claimed the porch as his permanent station. I held the dog tags in my palm, same as I had that first afternoon, feeling the weight of them, the smoothness of the worn edges. On the back of the cedar box, running my thumb along the bottom edge, I'd found 4 words carved in small, careful letters, the kind someone makes when they mean a thing to last. Home is what you keep. I turned the phrase over in my mind the way you do with something that says a true thing plainly. I had kept it. Through 9 years and 2 wars and a shoulder that predicted rain and a family that had needed time and an aunt who finally remembered what soap her mother used, I had kept it the way my grandfather kept this house. Not perfectly, not without difficulty, but with the stubborn, quiet belief that some things are worth the maintenance. That afternoon, a few cars pulled into the drive. Linda got out first, carrying a casserole dish with oven mitts still on her hands, looking slightly uncertain about the porch stairs. Gary followed with a 6-pack of something cold. Behind them, 2 neighbors I half remembered from childhood, the kind of people who show up to things because the mountains teach you that showing up is what you do. I stood. Linda looked at the repaired porch, the new fence, the flag on the post. She looked at the swing moving gently in the breeze. "He would have liked this," she said. "I know," I said. "I built it for that reason." We ate dinner on the porch as the afternoon folded into evening. The conversation was careful in some places and easy in others, the way it is when people are learning a new version of how to talk to each other. Gary told a story about Grandpa Earl that I'd never heard. Something about a fishing trip and a borrowed truck and a very bad decision that had somehow ended well. Everybody laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that doesn't need permission. At one point, Linda reached over and touched my sleeve, the jacket I'd kept on, the same way I always did when I needed to remember who I was. And she said, quietly, just to me, "She would have liked seeing you in that." I looked at her. She used to say, "My Sarah knows who she is, C.E. My Sarah knows who she is." I think I hated her for saying it. I don't anymore. I didn't say anything, I just nodded. After everyone left, I stayed on the swing as the dark came in full and the stars appeared one at a time above the ridge. Biscuit had fallen asleep across my feet, snoring in the peaceful, committed way of a dog with no unfinished business. I looked up at the stars the way my grandmother had taught me to, finding the ones with names, then the ones without. Then just watching the whole of it, the way you do when you stop trying to make sense of the size and just let it be large. I thought about the courtroom. My aunt's startled laugh, my uncle's slow head shake, The judge's voice going quiet in a room full of people who went quiet with it. I hadn't worn the uniform as a weapon. I'd worn it because it was true. Because when you spend years becoming something, you don't apologize for it in the places where it matters most. You walk in as exactly who you are, and you let the room decide what to do with that. I had learned in a lot of difficult places that the quietest kind of strength is the kind that doesn't need the room to agree. I pressed the dog tags once in my palm, then tucked them into my jacket pocket against my chest. "Okay, Grandma," I said to the dark. "I've got it from here." The swing moved gently. The flag shifted in the small wind off the mountains. And for the first time in a long time, I was exactly where I was supposed to be, in a place that was mine. In a life that I had earned. At peace in a way that no courtroom could give and no family could take. That kind of peace, the kind you build board by board, year by year, mile by mile, that's the only kind worth keeping.